is combined photovoltaic and agricultural systems, research methods, and applications in agrivoltaics. We're very pleased to be featuring a presentation from the Fraunhofer Institute of Solar Energy, arguably Europe's leading solar research center. Following a recent session with the AFT staff, we're very motivated to share Fraunhofer's insights with a select group of experts and partners. This is primarily a Northeast regional audience, but we have folks from across the country on today's call. And this is something of an experiment for us. We're very eager to get your input from this session, and we hope that it will trigger further thought and collaboration with AFT and all of you. So without further ado, we'll dive in. Next slide, Emerald, please. We know that climate change directly threatens farmers' ability to feed a growing population while protecting our nation's air, water, soil, and biodiversity. Aggressive action to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to sequester carbon can still limit the worst effects of climate change. Many of you are aware of the most recent report from the IPCC, but that window is closing, and it's closing fast. A rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will require a massive shift to renewables at scale. At the same time, we will need to advance strategies that support climate-smart, regenerative agriculture and that build resilience in our food systems. We simply cannot solve the climate change crisis without integrated approaches and systems thinking. And with this in mind, AFT is very excited to be sharing insights from the Fraunhofer Institute team this morning with all of you. Next slide, please. A little bit of context will be helpful for this morning's conversation. The Department of Energy issued a report last year, the Solar Futures Study, which outlines a pathway for a fully decarbonized electrical grid by mid-century. Basically, what this is telling us is that meaningful progress for decarbonization will require solar energy generation at a significant scale and far beyond what we have seen up to this point. We're going to need 60 gigawatts of solar installed every year between 2030 and 2050. That's 3 times the current pace of deployment. And because of economies of scale, the trend will be for ground-mounted community solar and increasingly large utility scale solar projects. At the same time, we're going to need to see much more solar on rooftops, landfills, and brownfields. There's simply not enough of those kinds of sites to accommodate the solar that we're going to need to fully decarbonize. Based on the Solar Futures estimate of 7.5 acres per megawatt AC, this means roughly 450,000 acres of additional solar will be needed per year for the next 2 decades. This report concludes that we'll need about 10 million acres in all, increasing solar's share of our electrical power from 3% to 40 to 45%. The good news is that that's less than 0.5% of the land area in the contiguous US. However, 90% of the solar build-out is expected to be in rural areas, and in the Northeast, that is likely to be agricultural land. A recent Cornell study showed, in fact, that over 80% of the land most suitable for utility scale solar energy in New York would be highly productive agricultural land. Many of you are on the front lines of this, and that's why we're here today. Next slide, please. So the challenge before us is to understand and minimize trade-offs between clean energy and agricultural viability. Put another way, how can solar be designed and developed to support farmers, incorporate soil health, and sustain agriculture? One way to contextualize these impacts and questions is through American Farmland Trust Farms Under Threat and our 2020 State of the States report. Farms Under Threat includes a nuanced spatial analysis of our nation's agricultural land. And I'm going to ask Emran to put that link in our chat so you have it. This data provides a basis for state and federal funding to protect farmland, incentives for climate smart farm practices, and the wise use of our country's most versatile, productive, and resilient farmland. As many of you on this call can attest, there is concern that large-scale solar can lead to a loss of prime farmland and impacts to rural economies that depend on agriculture. It's also true that many of the states seeing the most intense solar development pressure now, states like Texas, North Carolina, New Jersey, have also seen significant farmland attrition over the last few decades. And that is exactly why AFT is focusing on smart solar. Next slide, please. Broadly speaking, AFT has 3 synergistic strategies to advance smart solar. We inform key decision makers, including leaders on this call, about important decisions related to solar on farmland. We advance policies that protect the best farmland, minimize displacement, and encourage dual use. It's the dual use that we're going to be focusing on with Fraunhofer. Third, we support research, technical assistance, and demonstration projects. This on-the-ground work informs best practices and furthers innovation. At the center of this work is thoughtful engagement and input from diverse stakeholders: farmers and landowners, land access advocates, solar industry, ag researchers and extension, agency leaders, and elected officials. We have all of those folks on today's call. Really glad to have you. Next slide, please. AFT recognizes that to be effective, smart solar strategies need to take a holistic approach. For AFT, smart solar is based on the premise that we can and we must scale renewable energy in ways that, 1, minimize loss of the most productive agricultural land, 2, support soil health and regenerative practices, as well as the next generation of farmers, and 3, benefit farm viability and rural communities that depend on agriculture. After all, it is farmland owners who are likely to be asked to host many of the utility scale solar and wind projects powering our transition to a clean energy economy. Next slide, please. So today we're talking about agrovoltaics, sometimes referred to as agri-solar or agro-photovoltaics. This is the form of dual use in which an area of land is used simultaneously for both solar generation and agriculture. At AFT, we regard dual use as an important element of smart solar. We also recognize that there is still much to learn. Dual use comes in various forms. It can include solar facilities that support forage for livestock. Many of you may be aware of the growing interest in sheep grazing as a cost-effective, farm-friendly means of vegetation management on solar projects. Today's conversation is specifically focused on solar that is combined with food crops. This is Fraunhofer's focus and specific area of expertise. It is also an area requiring a good deal of sophistication in terms of research, modeling, and applications. What is the potential for agrivoltaics? We don't know yet, but with the proper market incentives and guidelines, it does appear to be quite promising. We'll hear more from Fraunhofer on this. Bifacial panels, elevated arrays, more complex tracking algorithms, and intelligent site design can create novel microclimates. Crops can grow and even thrive under the solar systems. And having the right vegetation can even enhance the productivity of the solar panels themselves. So this early research is very interesting. As we'll hear from Fraunhofer, countries such as Japan and France are making agrivoltaics a pillar of their national campaigns to accelerate clean energy. As well, states such as New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, and New York are exploring incentives and pilot programs for dual use. As we'll hear from Fraunhofer this morning, I encourage you to keep an open mind and think about how farmers, service providers, and solar energy entrepreneurs in your state could apply insights from their research. Next slide, please. As I wrap up my introduction, I want to again thank you all for joining this morning's special session. In the spirit of partnership and common purpose, we're very excited to share Fraunhofer's important work with all of you. These are just a few of the state agencies and extension programs attending today's call. We appreciate all the experts who are taking time to be with us today. You are on the front lines of solar development and farmland protection in the Northeast. Our hope is that today's session will animate some new thinking and perhaps light a fuse. We also hope it will build support for AFT's work in this space. We look forward to your feedback and to opportunities to partner and build capacity to advance smart solar. In my last slide, I just wanted to highlight here our agenda. Without further ado, very pleased to present today the Fraunhofer ISE team. We will have 3 short presentations. Kavin Amalong will provide an introduction into Fraunhofer and the organization's cutting-edge work in agrivoltaics. Matt Berwind will share some key highlights from the expanding research. Finally, Julia Riedelsheimer will offer insights on real-world industry applications. Again, given the size of today's session, please stay on mute. We may call on you. We will be monitoring the chat for questions, and we expect to have at least 20 minutes at the end for group discussion. So with that, Kavin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan, for the great introduction. Let me just get my screen shared. Should now be visible. Can I get a confirmation that the screen is visible?
You look good. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Well, first of all, AFT, Ethan, everyone, thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about agrivoltaics and what we do at Fraunhofer ISE. Yeah, so my name is Kavin Amelung. I'm a research assistant at Fraunhofer ISE. I've been here a little over a year now. I'm actually coincidentally also from the US, but then been in Germany now in Freiburg for upwards of 3 years, working on my master's, and now I'm also extending my program and everything to spend it a little bit longer in the group and continue working on this really exciting topic. Real quick, a little bit about the institute itself. So we've been around since the 1980s. And yeah, so we recently celebrated our 40th anniversary, and then our focus is solar energy. So Fraunhofer is a relatively large research conglomerate or society in Europe, focused in Germany, and then there's a bunch of different branches of Fraunhofer, and then our specific branch, ISE, focuses on solar energy. And then our institute is roughly 1,300 people, and then our group of around 40, majority of which are students, we focus on agrivoltaics, and that the technology of agrivoltaics falls under the group of integrated photovoltaics, which is just the application of photovoltaics in places where they weren't before. So just like a little bit of a expansion on photovoltaics. So the goal of today is trying to begin the conversation about agrivoltaics, and I think in order to do that, we really have to understand what agrivoltaics is. So what is agrivoltaics? Here are a couple of photos of agrivoltaics just to describe the vast diversity that one can find in this application. So here on the left, we have a facility in France. This is relatively old now, and they're also testing wooden substructures. And then on the right is one of our first research facilities, relatively large facility above arable farming. And then here on the left is another photo. This is from Italy. Another, let's say one multi-axis column-based PV structure, and on the right is a photo from Taiwan, I think, and this is now photovoltaics applied to greenhouses. On the left, we actually have a photo from the States. So this is Massachusetts, one of the pilot projects there, and on the right, one of our newer facilities that opened up last year in Germany. And then, this technology can also be applied to greenhouses, just an example of how really diverse this integrated technology can be. And then here, left and right, you have 2 examples of different greenhouse applications. dry land is not the only application of this technology. You can also start looking at aquaculture. Then here on the left, it's a photo in China. On the right is, I think, a rendering of how a aquavoltaic facility could look like. And a little bit more in terms of examples. On the right, we have a vertical design, a vertical system installed relatively close to us here in Germany. And on the left, another example of sheep grazing, but now in the States. Again, another example of arable farming on the left, and then on the right, in Netherlands, you'll find this pilot system, or this rather commercial system, above blueberries. Interesting to note is that this company here on the left, REM Technology, they began exploring agrivoltaics over 10 years ago, made a decent amount of progress, but then the company went bankrupt and didn't work out too well. I think it was unrelated to agrivoltaics, but then just had some challenging times, and now they're back again exploring agrivoltaics. But this here on the left is a relatively old system. But yeah, so with so many different applications, and we're just touching the surface, we find it necessary to have some sort of classification to better understand this really broad field. And this is a classification we worked on last year and have begun releasing this year, where we looked at a couple of other classification schemes and then decided on this one. The couple of key distinctions with this classification is that, first of all, we call the technology agrivoltaics. As Ethan was hinting at, there's more than a handful of names for this technology. So agrivoltaics is what we thought was the most appropriate. And in terms of how the scheme works, we look at two different types of systems. So we have categorized into open and then closed systems. In terms of closed systems, the type of systems you would find would be something like PV greenhouses, as I was showing some photos, or even just directly opaque buildings. And then interesting to notice here, all these blue, a little bit shaded boxes is what we consider agrivoltaics only in a very broad definition. So the typical definition, the narrow ESA definition, does not include opaque buildings. So what that would mean would be vertical farming with agrivoltaics on top, or rooftop photovoltaics, so PV on top of barns, stables, etc. These are all applications where there is no sharing of light, and so we don't really consider that agrivoltaics in a narrow definition. In terms of open system, where we're also very active as a group, the big distinction we make is between inner space PV and overhead PV. So inner space PV, the idea is that you'll have agriculture typically between the photovoltaic panels or between the rows of PV. For overhead PV, as the name suggests, it's directly above agricultural activity. Within these structural groups, it's quite easy to find different PV technologies. So you could look at static or fixed systems. You can also be looking at multi-axial systems, either one axis, two axis, and then all of these technologies can be applied to different farming techniques or farming categories. So for example, grassland farming, arable farming, this is typically more inner space PV. However, arable farming can also have overhead PV, so where the photovoltaics are directly above the arable land or the agricultural activity. Another large category where we're very active as a group is horticulture. So anything, everything, specialty crops, perennials, protected cultivation, orcharding, etc. This is all horticulture, noticeably distinct from the application in arable farming because of a large difference in clearance height. So an arable farming facility will have a much larger clearance height to make space for these, these really big combine harvesters that one would need. And then as I was saying, our narrow definition of agrivoltaics is pretty much only as open and closed, where closed is limited to PV greenhouses. One thing that we think is quite interesting is that in the US, beekeeping and pollinators is quite, that application, that combination is quite common and has been growing in momentum, but we wouldn't consider that agrivoltaics in a narrow definition, just because there is no sharing of light. And we don't have to make that decision to prioritize the agricultural side of this system. One of the things we did as a group last year was release this preliminary DIN spec. So for those unfamiliar with DIN spec, it is a standard used in European, specifically German industry, comparable to ISO. And here, this was a combination of, a collaboration with a couple of universities, and then over 10 industry partners. And the idea here was that, look at everyone's definition of agrivoltaics, and then come to a compromise of what we consider agrivoltaics to be in this preliminary standard, also available in English to review. And the main point here is that in this combined use of the same land, the agricultural production has is the primary use. Some key facts about this standard, this preliminary standard. It was published last year in April. It is preliminary, so this means the idea that we had when we released it was that after 2-3 years, we will sit back, or we needed to sit down and look at it again, and then make modifications. This is already an ongoing process, but this really is a compromise between multiple different stakeholders. So not just a product of our work in our institute. So as I was saying, roughly 15 partners in this consortium. It was led specifically by us, Fraunhofer ISA, and an agricultural university, University of Hohenheim. And the main goal was to identify agriculture as the primary use. Some characteristics of this DIN spec, of this norm, is that we only look at open systems, and agriculture is not considered. The two main categories, the two main categories of this DIN spec is directly interspace PV and overhead PV. I'll have some figures and some information coming up. But some other criteria or core requirements associated with this DIN spec is that the agricultural yield must maintain at least 66% of the reference yield, which means that there's a historical yield that we are aware of and that has been controlled and submitted as a proposal when the facility was first conceptualized. And the facility must maintain 66% of this historical reference yield, and the agricultural use of the land must be guaranteed. Within these two different categories, overhead and interspace PV, we set a land loss limit to roughly 10% and 15%. And the main goals of the standard is to avoid things like soil erosion, avoid damage, and then, even during the dismantling phase, there has to be considerations made towards the agricultural use. So large damage has to be avoided. Category 1, overhead PV. Here there's a couple of examples of what kind of system we could be looking at. So it could be a static system, it could be an axial system. One of the key dimensions of this DIN spec is the value 2.1 meters. So this is what we consider as the minimum clearance height of an agrivoltaic facility under category 1. And that number wasn't arbitrary. It was actually identified off of German law, where any system or any sort of construction above agricultural land cannot be less than 2.1 meters for the safety of humans working underneath, of the workers working underneath. So this is what we use as a limit of 2.1 meters. And as I was saying, this can really be applied to many different agricultural practices. So single year, long term, etc., etc. The other category that we have in this DIN spec is interspace PV. Here again are a handful of different applications that one could find in this category. So this example right here is an example of a vertical system. Here is another example of a more track system, and then here below, more similar to ground-mounted PV, however, often with a bit more elevation. So that means a little bit more space here below the modules to grow crops. This is really only an introduction to agrivoltaics. In terms of getting further information, I could seriously recommend our guideline. So we first published one in October 2020. This has been translated from German now to English as well. And then just, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, we released an update to this guideline. Currently, it's only in German. The English version will be incoming. And in terms of scope, so really great foundational knowledge about agrivoltaics, and then a couple of chapters specifically focused on Germany. So this is from the German context. However, the foundational information is certainly quite useful. In terms of scope, I think the October one is roughly 40 pages, and the new one is a bit longer, an extra 10-20 pages, something like that. And then for anyone who would really like to get deeper into the field, I could seriously suggest the Agrivoltaics 2022 conference. This is now the third conference. And first one was held in France, second one was held here in Germany, hosted by us, and then this conference will now be hosted in Italy. It'll be both online and in person. Registration should be opening up relatively soon. And yeah, so this is honestly 3 days of just really great content in terms of information about agrivoltaics. We'll have a presence there as well, and then an audience and participation from around the whole world. I think I'm running low on time now. Perhaps later, if we have time during discussion, I would love to also go over some more policy-specific information. So we can look at a couple of countries and some of the big distinctions in terms of how they approached the policy governing agrivoltaics, where in all honesty, Germany is not the forerunner. I would say Japan has been advanced in agrivoltaics since 2013, I think, and then now Germany is really just catching up. So even in terms of capacity and installed capacity, Germany is not wildly far ahead. That would definitely be countries like Japan, China, Korea, France, for example.
Calvin, thank you very much. Could you comment on what kind of interaction your research team has had with other state agencies in the U.S. or other researchers? Just give us a sense of how much interaction have you had with agrivoltaic specialists here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I mean, collaborating with the international audience or the international community is something that we do. Absolutely. We certainly love doing that. Specifically, the U.S. We have not entered into any sort of concrete projects or anything like that. However, we have had contact with a couple of either universities or institutes. So yeah, obviously AFT. There's lots of research being done by in Arizona State. We had extensive contact with them, as well as there's a artificial intelligence Institute for Food Systems, I think AIFS, based in UC Berkeley and UC Davis. We've had extensive contact with them, as well as some researchers in New Jersey. So no concrete projects in the US, not yet. Certainly something we're interested in, but yeah, we haven't, for example, built any pilot projects in the US.
That's great. The reason I mention that is it just shows to everyone on the call that we are really on the bleeding edge here, connecting the work that you're doing, Calvin, and thinking about at the state agency level where we can provide this intelligence, and also at the Department of Energy. And through the National Renewable Energy Lab, there is more and more momentum to get a good sense of the potential for agrivoltaics and support the research and to apply that in the industry. So there's so much in front of us, and this is really exciting how you framed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the DOE, we also have had contact with AgriSolar Clearinghouse. Hopefully we'll also be having some webinars there in the coming months. We'll have to see. But yeah, definitely a key contact point in the US.
We have a question that I think will be a theme for our discussion later, but I'll just plant it now, which is just from a finance perspective, what are some of the considerations that we need to think about in terms of additional cost and how these projects pencil, basically? Yeah,
so I mean, one of the biggest costs in terms of agrivoltaics beyond the scope of normal ground-mounted photovoltaics is the substructure. And this is also a thing you'll notice between interspace PV and overhead PV, where interspace PV is typically categorized by much lower substructures, and overhead PV has those higher substructures, and those are very expensive and very large amounts of steel, which also brings in the questions of sustainability. How worth it is it to have such a large amount of steel? So in terms of the economic side, overhead PV is quite expensive, and there has been effort, and we are engaged in a couple of projects to reduce those costs and to make sure that they're worth it. So in terms of reducing costs, introducing things like cabling systems, tensile cabling systems to avoid very large steel costs. But yeah, there's no doubt that agrivoltaics will have a higher capex than a normal ground mounted PV.
More to come on that, I'm sure, as we hear from the others. So Kevin, thank you very much for the introduction. We have some more questions coming up in the chat, but we'll circle back. And Matt, you're on.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'll introduce myself really quickly as I share the screen. My name is Matt. So I'm the other part of our American delegation with Kevin there. We can all see my screen, right? Okay, great. It's always good for a bit of a sanity check. So I'm a scientist at the Fraunhofer ISE here. And my main areas are in APV project management, but then also in developing our predictive tools, so our modeling tools for things like PV performance, agricultural performance, but then also relevant to this question that we just received, some of the economic analysis. And today I'd like to show you or give you some of our research highlights, basically touch bases on some of our larger projects that have been in the pipeline. Maybe I'll briefly describe some of the results. If I can get that to move, there we go. So one of our earliest projects was in the Lake Constance region of Germany. We called this project APV Resola, and this was this spawned directly from the mind of the originator of the, well, one of the originators of the agrivoltaics concept and the former founder of the Fraunhofer ISE, Professor Götzberger. So with this project, we were able to perform some initial plant studies in cooperation with the University of Hohenheim. But Julia Riedelsheimer, my colleague, will describe a bit more the actual results of this process. Some of the key agricultural crops there, some of the key crops there were clovergrass, potato, wheats, a couple of wheat cultivars, if I'm correct there. And the system had to be designed for that. So we needed to fit some large harvesting equipment for the wheat harvest, for example, beneath it. But Julia Riedelsheimer, as I mentioned, will go into that in greater detail in the follow-up presentation. So one of our newer projects, one of our newer installations was constructed and designed and constructed in 2020. Construction wrapped up actually last year spring, and it's in the area of Gelsdorf, Germany, which probably doesn't say too much to you, but if you heard about these catastrophic floods from last year, this is exactly that region. So these types of climate change resilience projects are of particular regional importance, and we've seen that there's quite high acceptance for these types of installations. The key focus here was establishing some knowledge on different apple variants. So we have 8 different types of apple trees producing in the system, and we're also looking at things like different spatial distributions of our solar cells. So how essentially the apple trees will react to the heterogeneous light conditions beneath an agrivoltaic system. And you can see that if you can see my mouse cursor, you can see actually 2 different cell layouts in this image here. We have one with relatively equally spaced out solar cells and one with more zebra strips. One of the very fun points here that's always worth mentioning is that in August we will have a small festival with some local and federal politicians to celebrate the first agrivoltaic apple harvest in Germany. So if anyone finds themselves on summer holiday and would like to come to an open event like that, just let us know. So coming up, I have two of our African projects actually in a row for you. As Kevin mentioned, we're not just active in Europe and Germany, but also we're expanding our presence across the world, looking at different climate regions and different parts of the planet where specific techno-economic models or use cases need to be examined. And in this case, we're looking at WaterMed, which is a project site in Algeria along the Mediterranean. And the key focus here is really how can agrivoltaics contribute to water use optimization in this agricultural water energy food nexus. We have some unique module layouts here. If you look closely, you can see that these modules are actually V-shaped, so like a chevron, an inverted chevron like this. And in the middle of the modules, rainwater can be collected and then used for irrigation purposes beneath the system. Here, I'm happy to report that the first potato harvest was recently shared with us, and the preliminary results look quite good, seeing bonuses in the plant yield. But more information will come regarding that. So the second African project is in Mali and the Gambia. And here we're again looking at the water energy food nexus. Unfortunately, this project has seen some COVID-related delays, but we're finally getting construction going right now. Again, this will be focused on the water energy food nexus that is so important in arid and semi-arid regions of the world, as we have seen some reduced evapotranspiration under agrivoltaic systems, which leads to some water-limited crop production booms. Another direction that we're working on is in Southeastern Asia aquaculture. So for those who are aware, some of the aquacultural activities can be relatively intense. So with high density of shrimp farming, for example, under the system. And in this project, shrimps, we're looking at ways that we can essentially optimize the nutrient usages of these aquaculture, of the shrimp cultivation operations, by varying the light levels in their growth ponds. So the concept is that more light will of course result in higher algae production of the ponds, but maybe also have some other knock-on effects that result in a better or a higher quality shrimp product, potentially also with higher biomass yield, with higher shrimp yield. Another project, this is also in the Mediterranean region, but specifically the European Mediterranean regions. This project is called SUSMedHouse, so it's short for Sustainable Mediterranean Greenhouses, essentially. And here, what we're looking at is different economic models in the greenhouse area of agrivoltaics. So essentially, how can we control light distribution on some horticultural crops like tomatoes, peppers, and lettuce? And will these crops actually benefit from having some shading in these high solar irradiation areas of the world? We're also using some artificial intelligence methods, some image correlation, to quantify and examine the plant growth. As Kevin mentioned, we're working on some other methods of reducing the CO2 footprint and material requirements in some of our systems. This is so on the right, you'll actually see a picture of a pilot agrivoltaic system, and not the full agrivoltaic system being realized in the system, in this project, I'm sorry. But in this project, Hyperfarm, we're looking at how we can integrate green energy with farm co-location into the hydrogen economy and the booming hydrogen economy of Europe. So three of the ideas here are that We can reduce some of the steel costs and steel demands by using tensile cables for portions of the support structure in these tracked systems, actually. We can also use some electrolysis we can use this green energy for electrolysis and hydrogen production, and subsequently also use bio-waste from the farming processes for pyrolysis and hydrogen production. And we can also, after pyrolysis, for example, use this biochar to potentially increase soil quality. But this project is currently also in construction. I think if this meeting were about a month later, you could see a really interesting 300 kilowatt peak tracked setup in southern Bavaria. Another project that we're working on is actually in the area to the west of Cologne, Germany. So this is a traditional coal mining region of Germany. Its economy is very strongly based around these coal processes. And here the project APV 2.0 is meant to show some of the economic use cases that can lead to a transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy-based one, and hopefully come up with some circular bioeconomy concepts that can then be expanded as this system transitions to its new position. One of the key developments here, or one of the key research points here, is that we have an in situ phenotypic monitoring system. So essentially, a camera system traveling across this installation will monitor plant development across the growing cycles multiple times a day and give us feedback on how these plants really respond to the conditions. One larger project that's still unfortunately in the conception phase is called the model region of Baden-Württemberg. So Baden-Württemberg, I'm sorry, is a state in southwestern Germany, with Stuttgart, for example, and Freiburg, where we are in it. Right, the concept for this project is that we would like to establish 5 different agrivoltaic systems looking at a variety of specialty crops. So these specialty crops are of high regional importance and also have they're typically high value crops. So maybe something like a raspberry or a cherry or something like this that's are quite widespread across the state. And the idea is to look more at the financial underpinnings that could make these types of technologies proliferate without the necessity of, for example, some extra feed-in tariffs or other measures. Another key focal point is to provide some guidelines for regulators, so that as crazy and innovative farmers and scientists want these systems installed, they have some ways of managing the permitting guidelines. So that for me is the presentation. Maybe we can open up for the next questions, Ethan.
Thank you, Matt. We have lots of questions coming in, and I'm going to put these in a couple of different batches. Kevin, this might include you as well. Going back to the reference yield, how was that established? What was the kind of rationale or the process that you all went through with the German guideline for the 66% reference?
I've seen all the questions. First of all, thank you everyone for all these great questions. Regarding the 66% requirement, so like I was saying, it's pretty much just like a negotiated or compromised number. The basis, or one of the bases that one also could use, is in Japan. So in Japan, the reference or the maximum yield, minimum yield is actually 80%. And if it's not maintained, then the facility has to be removed. And yeah, first of all, the 66%, it'll be incorporated a little bit in the design phase. To what extent, I'm not exactly sure, but then also controlled or checked every 3 years. And in terms of whether or not, what the exact effect of the agrivoltaic facility is, completely depends on the design of the facility. So yeah, you can have neutral, increase, or decrease. There really is no way to say which one it is without looking at a specific facility. However, it's not a simple thing where it's guaranteed to decrease or it's guaranteed to increase. We have seen pretty much everything. Depending on the crop, you can calculate some sort of, you can incorporate some sort of increase, especially if you make these considerations during the design process. But yeah, so 66% is definitely, I would say, quite, that's rarely should an agrivoltaic facility be so detrimental to the yield.
Kevin, I think Matt mentioned one of the projects having a bump in yield, and you just suggested that. Could you all comment on how a project could produce an increase in yield? What kind of interactions are you seeing in terms of the microclimate or temperature or moisture that is driving that? And I realize it's crop dependent, but if you could generalize, that would be great.
Maybe we could save that after Julia's presentation. I think she's covering some of that a little bit already. Very
good. And there's a lot to talk about there. I guess it's a simple question with a lot of answers. So we'll hold that. Maybe another question, we'll just touch on it and we'll get more into it in the broader discussion. A number of folks are asking about how these sorts of configurations can be incentivized. And I think, Matt, you mentioned the special feed-in tariffs. Obviously, this varies by market, but what are you seeing in terms of sort of threshold incentives that are necessary for industry to take this on? And I do see a comment from Lucy at Lightstar Renewables. You know, there are companies really looking to do this at essentially no or very marginal impact to CapEx. And that's really kind of the holy grail here, if we can figure that out.
Yeah, that's really the holy grail that we're laying all of our research projects to slowly get toward. How can we realize systems where you don't need any sort of incentives? Okay, yes, you're always going to have a lower return on investment for a solar developer, but if there's a bump in yields on the agricultural side, if the PV yields are also then similar to what a typical utility scale system might be, then this is something that people will take into consideration at a much larger extent. And there are some promising economic models already there, especially where, so in my presentation, I showed some specialty crops where we're looking at, for example, these apple orchards. In these apple orchards, you already need some hail protection or weather protection. If a farmer can directly replace hail protection nets with an agrivoltaic system, then one, they have lower maintenance costs because they don't need to replace these plastic tunnels every once in a while, or sorry, these nets every once in a while. And two, they get a second source of income. So they also have some higher financial security if, for example, their crop gets wiped out for whatever reason that may be. Now, with an apple, that's not necessarily as relevant an example, but in some other crops like grape for wine, for example, that's extremely relevant. If you follow some of these late frost events from the previous year, these types of robust agrivoltaic offers are attractive on multiple levels.
Thank you, Matt. I think we'll move on to Julia and circle back to a number of these questions. They're really juicy and so relevant. So Julia, thank you so much. We'll move on to you.
Thank you. I have to share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, you're good.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you also from my side for this opportunity. I'm very excited to show our results and to share our ideas with you. My name is Julia, and I started working at the Fraunhofer ISE about a little longer than a year ago. And I studied agricultural science, so I'm most likely responsible for all the agricultural questions that, as you already said, are sometimes very difficult to answer, even though they might sound simple. Yeah, so today I would just like to give you a quick insight on the agricultural opportunities and obstacles. To better understand the advantages that agrivoltaics may bring, I would like to start with the current challenges or problems that farmers or the agricultural sector in general is facing. And there's basically two main aspects. So first, particularly in Germany or Europe, but also elsewhere, we have the land use conflict. So we have an increasing population coupled with an increasing demand. We have the transition or the need to transit towards renewable energies. And we have decreasing arable land. So put all of that together, it is of very high interest, and it will be very important to use that scarce land that we have as efficient as possible. And then on the second side, we have the climate change issues. So the agricultural sector is already now affected very strongly by the increasing CO2 levels, particularly by the increasing temperatures that we can see on the right side in yellow. And also what we observe is that the rainwater or the precipitation events are not as homogeneous anymore. So we have periods of long droughts, and then on the other side we have very heavy rainy winds with hail. So all of that put together, crops need to be protected from, on the one side, too much sun and drought, and then on the other side, too much rain, for example, with hail. So agrivoltaics here is a strategy to succeed in the energy transition, but then at the same time to protect the crops from those weather extreme to avoid yield losses or yield fluctuations. But so from a farmer's perspective, it is of course most importantly to know, so what do the PV panels do to the plants? How would such a facility influence the microclimate, and what impact would that have on the development, the yields of my crop? And that is very tough to generalize. Microclimatic changes, they very much, they're not very easily to sum up. It depends a lot on the exact setup of the PV construction itself. It depends on the crop selection, of course. All crops react differently. And the environmental conditions that are prevailing at each site, which are also different. But still, I try to give some theoretical input on some parameters. I will start with the light, because I think this is most obvious that PV panels, they create a dynamic shade. And with that, they reduce the crop available radiation. And light is, of course, crucial for crop growth. But as we can see here on the right side, the light intensity and the photosynthetic activity, they're not related linearly. So that means if we look, for example, at this red curve, we can see that at low light levels, when the light increases, we have an increase in photosynthetic activity, but that starts leveling off at a certain point until this light saturation point is reached. And that light saturation point means that from here on, if I add more light to my crops, I do not have any impact on the photosynthetic activity. On the other side, if I shade within that level, I also do not have any impact on my yields. But of course, all crops react differently to shade. So here in red, we see a sun species. So the sun species are very sensitive to shade. At the bottom in blue, we have a shade species. So they are more shade tolerant, and we can reduce the light more without having too much impact on the yield. But most likely those curves are unknown, and they're just a theory of other factors. For example, water limit crop growth, then those curves also look very differently than from what you see now. A PV construction, of course, also has an impact on the rainwater distribution. So we have this sheltered area on the one side, and then on the other side we have the strip edge. So under the strip edge, the wet spots may appear, and that could result in surface runoff. So that, of course, we have to avoid. We need to protect our soil and also keep the nutrients within the system. That is one aspect that we have to consider, and the other one is that it needs to be investigated whether this heterogeneity that we see at the surface also transfers into deeper soil layers. But here, as roots of crops have the capability to grow towards humid zones, they will probably compensate for that. So they will grow towards the humid zones and therefore compensate for if there was an uneven distribution of precipitation, even in the lower layers. The air temperature in such a system is also affected. So what the PV panels do is they decrease the heat input during the day, but at night they better retain the thermal reflection. So normally we have during the day we have fluctuations that naturally occur. But the PV panels, they buffer those fluctuations, and they decrease both extremes. And that can have an effect on the phenological development of crops, because how fast or slow crops develop depends on the temperature sums that they experience. About the soil moisture, that's a very important point where many advantages can be found, because shading can be beneficial to the crops, because particularly when it's very hot and very dry, the crops need to transpire less because they don't have to cool down so much. So they need less water. And at the same time, the soil is exposed less to the sun. So also the evaporation, so the water that leaves through the soil is reduced. So all in all, the evapotranspiration is reduced. The water is kept in the system, and that we can measure by increased soil moisture levels, and that reduces the stress level of crops. So then about APV Resolar, Matt already introduced it a little bit. I will give you more details. So it was installed in South Germany. It has a capacity of 200 kilowatt peak. The maximum height for machineries to pass is 5 meters. And as Matt already said, we looked at it for 2 seasons, 16-17 and 17-18. And within those 2 years, we had a crop rotation with clovergrass, celery, winter wheat, and potato. That is about the orientation of the facility. So normally you may think that PV panels should be orientated towards south so that the maximum electrical yield can be gained. But in this graph on the left side, we can see that if the PV panels were to be orientated towards the south, we have a very heterogeneous light distribution. So between the panels, we have this drop in light, while directly underneath the panels, the light levels are higher. And we simulated what would happen if we were to turn it towards the south, towards the west. And as you can see on the right side, by the slight turn, the shade levels are very even on the ground. And that is very important because we want an even crop growth throughout the whole field. The crops should not develop differently. A little information on the modules. So monofacial modules, they have the biggest market share. Those are the ones with glass on front, and then they have this non-transparent layer in the back, and between they have silicium cells. Those could be used, but more beneficial are the so-called bifacial modules. Matt already mentioned them. They create electricity on both sides. So they're in a double glass design. They basically look the same from back and front. And the advantage is that they can create more electricity because in agrivoltaic systems, the system is lifted up very high, and also the distance between the modules is very big. So a lot of light can also reach the backside of those modules. And for us, most important are the semi-transparent modules. There you also saw a picture shown by Matt in APV Obstbau. And here it's also double glass, so glass in front and back, but the distance or the gap between the cells is a little bigger. So with that, more light can penetrate the cells and is therefore available for the crops. And in theory, the degree of transparency can be adjusted as the need of crops gives the values. And last, so-called OPVs, organic photovoltaics, are very interesting. They are made out of organic material, and it's basically, it brings two advantages. One, it is printed, and it can be printed on different materials. So we could print it, for example, on foils, which has other advantages than glass. It makes it very interesting for agrivoltaics. And the second advantage is that it's spectral selective. So we could use material that uses wavelengths that plants cannot use for, so plants use the wavelengths they need for photosynthetic activity. And then the wavelengths that plants do not need can be used for the electricity generation. But this is still in research. So about the results on the microclimate, we had a reduced radiation, about 30% that you can see on the left side. The green line shows what happens in the APV facility, and then orange is the reference. Also, the soil temperature was reduced and the soil moisture was increased. About the yield, the results are on the right side. So we observed 2 years, 2017 and 2018. 2017 is shown in orange. And we can see that the yield in 2017 was in celery, in clovergrass, it was 5%. And in celery, potato, and winter wheat, it was about 20% less as in comparison to the reference side. So in the APV facility, the yield decreased. But in 2018, so 1 year later, shown in green, we can see that in clovergrass, yield was still decreased in the APV facility. But then in the other crops, we had a yield increase, and in celery and potato of more or less 10%. So we had a big yield increase compared to the reference side. So what's the difference between the 2 years? 2018 was very hot and very dry in Germany or in all of Europe, while 2017 was a rather average year. And when you look on the left side, this is not measurements, it's a simulation, and it shows the potential transpiration, so the water that the crops need. And the orange line is what happens in the APV facility. And here we can see that the crops growing in the shade demanded less water, what we were assuming. Therefore, the water that was available was enough. And the drought stress that the crops had was reduced, and therefore the yield could be maintained and was lifted up compared to the reference field. Yeah, so that's it about arable land, where we had the project APV Resola. And in arable land, we have the advantage that there's a huge land potential. But we can also look at specialty crops, for example, vineyards, berries, apples, and all these crops. And there we see even more advantages. It was already shortly pointed out in the discussions, but many of those crops are they already have a very high demand for protective measures. So I only have numbers from Germany, but in 2015, 30% of apples, they already grew underneath those nets. And we have a trend that more and more farmers use that protective to increase their yield, that protection to increase their yields. For example, in raspberry, the protection went from 9% in 2012 to 27% in 2017. So there we observe this trend that more and more farmers grow under those protections. So looking at specialty crops, we have additional synergies or benefits because we can just replace the existing hail nets by the agrivoltaic system. With that, we reduce the amount of plastic, and we also increase the acceptance within the population because they're already used to growing apples under protection areas, for example. Also, we have the possibility to reduce pesticides because most of specialty crops, they are very susceptible to fungus or fungi, particularly when the leaves stay wet for a very long time. And by keeping the leaves dry, we can reduce the amount of pesticides or particularly fungicides that we need. And as Matt already said, we have a lower clearance height, so also the whole facility is cheaper and therefore economically more attractive. But the disadvantage is the land potential is decreased. This is a meta study that summarizes several papers that looked at how different fruits and berries react to different levels of shade. And if we look at berries, for example, we can see that at shade levels of about 30%, most of studies showed increases in yield. So they created this black line, which they simulated. And they say that if you shade berries between 20 and 40%, you most likely will get a yield increase. Of course, it depends on many aspects, but it's just a general summary of those studies, which is very interesting. So where does this come from? Of course, as I said, the drought stress or the water stress is reduced. Then also the temperature, some berries, for example, the blackberries, the primocane varieties, they bloom during very hot periods. So if we manage to reduce those temperatures in those periods, the damage is reduced and therefore yield could be increased. In vineyards, the high temperatures decrease the quality because we observe a change in the acid-sugar ratio, and that has an impact on the alcohol content. So by decreasing the temperatures, here we have the potential to go back to the old quality that we are used to. Late frost events are also a big threat in specialty crops, also in vineyards particularly. But with the agrivoltaic system keeping the temperatures higher, we also see the potential here to reduce that risk. And of course, weather extremes like hail or sunburn are reduced. Fungal infections, I already said, are reduced. Particularly in apple, we have problems with apple scrap. So those are the reasons why we see a higher potential or the biggest potential in specialty crops. Some results from PV greenhouses, or basically it's from one study done in Italy. They looked at floricultures, which are very, they tolerate a lot of shade. Horticulture crops are a little different. So there's shade tolerant crops and very sensitive crops. And the shade tolerant crops are asparagus, spinach, basil, strawberry, and lettuce. So they reacted with little yield decreases by reducing the light up to 50%. And while tomato and cucumber had yield reductions of up to 40%. Last slide about the challenges that we are facing. So first of all, the identification of suitable crops and shade tolerances. There's two reasons why this is so, or there's several reasons, but I want to talk about two reasons why it's so complicated. First of all, if there's research done, it's most likely or often happens on single leaf area. So you look at one leaf, how it reacts to the shade. But from there, it's very difficult to draw a conclusion about the whole plant. And then secondly, even if there are studies, it's very hard to generalize the results because they're done in different regions. They look at different varieties. The weather conditions, they're different every year. And also the developmental stages. So there's many aspects that make it difficult to compare those studies and to transfer the results to your case. What is also a challenge is to do the construction of the facility in orchards. If they already exist, that makes it, of course, more complicated than to have an area where there's nothing. And last, I have some numbers about the economy. So I think it refers to Germany, but it doesn't really matter. It's just more or less about the differences. So we see that in ground-mounted systems on the left side in blue, the prices for kilowatt hour are lowest. Then the next three are the APV systems where the prices are higher. And we can see that interspace systems, so the ones that are like close to the ground are very close to the ground mounted numbers, but then the overhead systems here, we have higher prices, but still lower than the rooftop facilities. Yeah, so that was my part. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you. And we're right on time for, I think, a good chunk of time here to talk a little bit about the questions that have come up here. So we have a few questions about the social acceptability. And Julia, you mentioned this. Could you comment on how either the policies are responding to kind of social resistance, or how are you seeing more interest in these APV systems because of the multiple benefits? If there's something you could comment in terms of the research on social acceptability there.
I personally haven't done so much research and so much knowledge on the social acceptance, but from what I know is that wherever a facility is built, the social acceptance is very high. So I know it from the Obstbau project that Matt showed. There was a study done where they directly asked the people that lived nearby or people that passed by, and they were all very surprised and very positive towards those systems and that facility. So I think people are aware of that we need this energy transition, and they're surprised how well, at least with those apple systems or specialty crops, how well it is possible to integrate electricity generation into agriculture. For arable land, it is a little different, but there, of course, we don't have so many facilities yet. Maybe Kavan, you can say something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't add too much more to that. Maybe I can post in chat. We have we released a paper a couple of years ago that looked at specifically APV Reusula. Did like a techno-economic analysis of that project. So that's, yeah, like I was saying, like a rather larger project of or rather larger substructure in arable farming. And there's some interesting figures on the capex, opex. So it really is site specific.
I think maybe a related question is the opportunity that APV systems could offer in terms of a niche or specialty services. I'm wondering if you all could comment on what you're seeing in terms of the technical needs that are coming up with managing for APV. Do you see a niche for a new type of entity that focuses on the crop production and is able to work across different projects on a turnkey basis? And I know there's some folks on this call who are doing some of that work. I think Ian Ward is on the call and could comment as well, but anything that you're seeing in terms of sort of specialty opportunities for APV farmers?
I can take a first stab at that, Ethan. Thank you. There is an opportunity. There's a tremendous, aside from the engineering side of things, which has been a lot of the conversation, on the agricultural side, lowering the barrier of entry for new farmers coming in and taking advantage of what is there, exploring what crops can grow in better conditions, and looking at water retention, soil organic matter generation. There is a market for an entity, to answer that question directly, that can take over the agricultural part of things so that the solar developers do what they do best and farmers do what they do best. And there's an intermediary role that seems to be of value.
Thank you, Ian. And Ian Ward is one of the folks sort of forging this niche in the Northeast. So appreciate that comment.
And maybe to talk about this niche a bit further from our side, and also touch back on the acceptance issues that that have been popping up in the questions as well. One niche where we really see some expansion potential in agrivoltaics, as we mentioned, is in the area of specialty crops. As Julia mentioned, of course, the potential available surface area for specialty crops is significantly lower than, of course, in arable farming. But we see very high acceptance, typically in the polled areas, because how are these specialty crops typically farmed? You have you'll have something like a plastic tunnel where agricultural activity takes place, and replacing this plastic tunnel with something that maybe provides a more attractive landscape image, like a stilted photovoltaic system, has been a working model. Or seems to be preliminary work in a preliminary manner working. Now, quantifying acceptance is, of course, a very tricky matter, but we're finding that through local community engagement, we're getting strong initial feedback with these pilot projects.
I think communication is everything. Just involve people as quick as possible. Not surprise them by just building something, but involve them in the process as early as possible.
Thank you for that. Maybe sort of related is a question about the variability that you pointed out, Julia. That was 2 years. Are there more years of data from that project? And sort of the background question is, how much of the variation is driven by just weather events versus a learning curve in terms of how you're managing on the ground, crop management?
So there was another year, the season of 2019 was also researched, but during that year they had a huge problem on like the whole area with weeds. So not only the reference or the APV side, so the results they couldn't really use well for anything, so there's nothing published. And the years after, they changed the crop rotation towards what did they use? Beetroot. So results that we could not compare to the years before. But yeah, the other part of the question is that's why we always compare it to the reference side, because the reference side is, of course, the yield that you get that particular year. So you can see how in every year the yield in the APV system distinguishes from the yield from a reference side. We can, of course, not compare just the yield from the agrivoltaic system to general yields. That would not, be a nice picture of how it is or what the impact of a PV construction would be. But I think the more results we get, APV is still, even though it exists some time, it's still rather new. And particularly when you work within agriculture, you just need long-term experiments. It's very hard to, even from those years, I mean, the results are great and it's basically what you would expect, but you can't really draw a conclusion from that. You have those results and they kind of like agree with the theories, but still we need more years of experiment to identify clear trends. So far, it's just, we have those 2 years and this is what happened in those years.
Jerry Polano, I may call on you. You've had a couple of questions for the Fraunhofer team. Jerry's been involved intimately in the agri-solar research in Massachusetts. And he had a question couple questions. Jerry, if you want to come off mute, you're welcome to ask.
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate it. And this has been really great. I really want to thank AFT and Fraunhofer for presenting your projects and all of your relevant information. Yeah, we're trying here in Massachusetts. We actually have an incentive program for agrivoltaics. The biggest challenge we have is there's a apparent lack of sunlight needs of all the crops, of a variety of crops. So the question I have for you all is, you've got a number of projects. What has been the basis of the solar design? How do you quantify the sunlight reaching the crops in terms of whether it's par, or is it just on off, sun is on, sun is off? We've got a tool that effectively is a simple trigonometry tool, which is the sunlight is either on or off. And it's a big challenge for us. We would like to have a lot more complex information, to be honest, that would allow us to better match a solar design's needs, an agricultural crop's needs to the solar design that's being presented above it. So it sounds, sorry if I asked too many questions in one, but just basis of your designs for whatever crops you have, and how do you quantify how much sunlight is coming through those systems? What kind of tools do you use? And I thank you for whatever you can provide.
Matt, I
So,
think this is on you.
yeah, I just keep on messing up. I'm touching my mechanical button and it doesn't work with Zoom. Anyway, yeah, Jerry, thanks for the question. That's one of the scientific questions that takes up about, I would say, 50% of my life. Anyway, so as a solar power, we're primarily a solar power institute. We've developed quite a few light simulation tools, or we've developed some robust light simulation tools with decades of validation. And these we've been able to apply to the field of agrivoltaics. Maybe you're familiar with the tool, the ray tracing tool Radiance. This is the basis of our light quantification tool. We input essentially we input 3D models of our system and sometimes of our plants in order to get the best possible idea of how light would be distributed at the plant level. And we use this as sort of a rough performance indicator. Now, you mentioned also some pretty tricky questions. So when the light is turned on and off has some really complicated implications, really complicated plant biological implications like photo inhibition and oxen uptake that we're trying to get a handle of in some of these systems where we have the in situ plant monitoring. But we don't, I think someone else had another question in there. We are working toward getting a repository of sunlight requirements in APV systems. And unfortunately, these sunlight requirements will almost always differ from traditional agricultural practice because of the heterogeneous distribution of light, both spatially and temporally. But we're working on it and are happy to share and collaborate on developing these concepts and this repository with as many institutes as possible.
Well, thank you. I may take you up. Your contact information will be provided as part of this.
Of course.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, Jerry, and that's really the spirit of this discussion, is to build further connections with Fraunhofer and the research teams on this call, the extension experts who are looking for models and tools. So much more to come, I think, on that. There is a question from Doug Wolfgang, who directs the Farmland Protection Program in Pennsylvania. And just a question about who owns the land that the projects, at least the ones in Europe that you've highlighted here, are these owned by farm families, or are they municipal properties? What kind of lease agreements are there on the projects where the APV is being built that you're working on?
I mean, so these are all pilot projects or research facilities. So I wouldn't say they're commercial business models. And yeah, so even in each specific project, it's a different ownership constellation. And then, yeah, how long the lease agreements are, I think that really depends on the business model, and something that we haven't really. I mean, I guess we do some exploration in business models and stuff like that. But I mean, in terms of lifetime, we try and stick to similar, or in terms of rough lifetime that we think about for the agrivoltaic facility, maybe not specifically the lease agreement. But yeah, we think of on the range of 20 to 30 years. So relatively standard ground mounted values. Thank
you, Kevin. Maybe I'll ask a couple of the developers who are on the call. We have some folks here from Blue Wave Solar and Lightstar. These are two companies that are really forging on the community distributed generation side with APV systems, and looking to do that in a way that may not require subsidies or a significant incentive. Anyone from Lightstar or Blue Wave want to comment on how you're approaching this? And we have just a few minutes.
This is Jesse from Blue Wave. I don't know that we'll get to a point where we don't need subsidies, but we're essentially trying to take a perspective of an agricultural design or an agricultural systems design and use that as one of the drivers for our PV design. So we're looking very closely at crop spacings, at the distribution of light without the scientific grounding that we're waiting for Matthew to help provide in terms of light heterogeneity. It gets hard to do without really good models of that. But I'm looking at, do I have zones which are good for diversified vegetable production of more shade tolerant crops, and then zones which are going to see more light in the system, which will work for less shade tolerant crops, and then line that up against, typical row spacings for, what does a 6-row planter need in terms of height clearances, width clearances, that kind of thing. So you have good agricultural row spacings and bed sets from a agricultural management efficiency. One of the biggest constraints we're finding, though, is environmental setbacks that apply to PV without applying to agriculture really beat up agrivoltaics.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Jesse said, and we are looking at states that have both incentives and don't have incentives. So a lot of the times, the incentive programs come with requirements and compliance measures, and then those states that don't have incentives, we are working directly with towns on a number of these issues, including setback requirements. And really, it's a farm plan, and we integrate PV into it. And one of the things that we are hearing constantly from policymakers on the energy side of things is that we don't want to take up farmland, but we also don't want to increase ratepayer impacts, especially right now. COVID is exacerbating a lot of energy pricing. So is Ukraine, all of this. So we're kind of caught where we need to be really innovative, but also not detrimental to the farming operation. And so what we're finding is there is actually a few off-the-shelf, just regular PV racking systems that we can, modify the design, the row spacing. So many times it's more than the 6'10", 2 torque tube height requirements that you guys were talking about. And we've seen through Jack's Solar Garden in Colorado, their first season and harvest, that it could work. And we actually think that there's a lot of there's better design and racking systems out there than Jack's used, which is now almost 4 years old. And we're really innovating on that. So we're very excited about what we've been seeing and what we've been doing in other states. And I just wanted to speak to the financing part of that, because that's there's two things that we at Lightstar really focus on. That's how do we get this to be farm centered, but also limit ratepayer impact so that we can scale this. And then also, what are the compliance measures to ensure that other developers in the industry can get into this and also not, pull the wool over the eyes of municipal leaders and things like that, making sure that this does stay in agricultural production. And we think that there's some really key US-centric policy mechanisms that we can use, such as farmland tax assessments. There's many states who already have requirements for entry into those kinds of programs, and so why not leverage those? So anyway, we could talk for hours about all of this, but we're very excited, and thank you so much to the Fraunhofer team for presenting all of this, and we're excited to contribute to the research on the US side too in the years to come.
Thank you, Lucy. We've got a couple minutes left here, and I just want to thank everyone for opening the door in this conversation. There is a lot more for us to explore here, and with Fraunhofer, available to be a research partner, potentially, a source of expertise, and many of you who are working on this in your agencies and in your companies. AFT is really interested in supporting this work as best as we can, and We're going to be putting out a survey for all of you to get additional feedback on how this is resonating, what your needs are, how you could support us in supporting you in this work. And we really look forward to your feedback through the survey. We'll also provide some links to materials from Fraunhofer. We mentioned the AgriSolar Clearinghouse, which is being run through the National Center for Appropriate Technology, new platform for collecting case studies and research related to dual use solar in the US, but they're also accepting international examples. So you may see some of the work that you saw this morning on the AgriSolar Clearinghouse as well. So much more for us to explore. I really don't see this as the end of the conversation, as really just the beginning. And I want to thank again our Fraunhofer team, Kevin, Matt, and Julia for your partnership and your expertise. We look forward to a lot more. I think your phone's going to be ringing from this group. And again, appreciate what you've coached us at AFT, just helping us reimagine this land, water, food, climate nexus that we have to figure out. I think with that, I'm going to give you all your morning back. Thank you very much for your time, and we will be in touch. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you, AFT
Thank you from
team.
our side.
Yeah,
It's
thank
been
you.
great. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Uh,